It was a hot summer afternoon when I first found out that my dad, my dad, was suing me. To put things into context, I'm a 28-year-old woman, and he's a 55-year-old narcissist who thinks the world revolves around him. Growing up, I always had this weird feeling that he saw me as a tool for his own personal gain, not as a daughter. But this was next level stuff. I remember the day I got the letter from his lawyer. I was sitting at home, sipping coffee and scrolling through Reddit like any other lazy Sunday morning, when the mailman knocked. I wasn't expecting anything, so I almost tossed the envelope straight into the recycling bin. But something about it stopped me. The thick, official-looking paper. The way my name was written in bold letters across the front. It felt wrong, like a gut punch. I tore it open, thinking it was some kind of joke, because, honestly, who the hell sues their own kid? But no! The words on the page hit me like a slap. My dad was suing me for, wait for it, money. And not just a few $1,000 or anything reasonable. No, he was asking for a ridiculous amount of money that, frankly, I didn't even have. And why? Apparently, I owed him for all the sacrifices he made while raising me. Yeah, you read that right. Sacrifices. Like he was some kind of saint who deserved to be compensated for the bare minimum he did as a parent. Now, don't get me wrong. My dad's always had this self-righteous vibe. Ever since I was a kid, he's been the kind of guy who tells everyone how much he's done for me, as if he's the only one who's ever lifted a finger in my life. The thing is, I grew up realizing that the only person he truly cared about was himself. He was never around when I needed him, never there to support me emotionally. Yet, here he was, claiming that I owed him. I let the letter sit on my kitchen counter for a good few hours, staring at it like it was some alien artifact. What could I even do with this? My first instinct was to laugh it off. Like, surely, this was just a cruel prank. But then I started thinking about all the times I caught him in lies, manipulated situations, and just generally acted like he was above everyone else. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. To him, I was just another asset he could use to fuel his inflated ego. At first, I didn't know how to react. My mind was racing. Should I even bother showing up to court? I mean, what was the point? But then it hit me. No way. I wasn't going to let this man, my father, get away with treating me like a pawn in his game. Not without a fight. But I wasn't going to just sit back and cry about it. No, I had something he didn't expect. Something that could shut him down for good. I started digging through old paperwork, bank statements, receipts, text messages, you name it. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Evidence. Evidence that would prove I'd been nothing but self-sufficient, even when he tried to take credit for my accomplishments. Evidence that would show I didn't owe him a damn thing. Let me tell you, going through old receipts felt like a trip down memory lane, a lane I was really not excited to revisit. But it wasn't just the receipts I was after. No, I was after the story. The real story that nobody had heard, the one that made my dad's sacrifices look like the selfish manipulations they really were. Each piece of paper I uncovered felt like another layer of armor I could use to shield myself from his nonsense. I remember the night before the court date. I could barely sleep. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the nerves were eating me alive. I thought about everything he'd put me through, the emotional abuse, the gaslighting, the endless manipulation, and how he was still trying to drag me down with his selfish demands. And I thought, this is it. This is where I take back my power. The day of the hearing, I could barely keep my hands from shaking. I showed up early, hoping to gather my thoughts, but when I walked into that cold, sterile courtroom, I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. My dad was already there, sitting smugly at the table with his lawyer, wearing that same condescending smile he always wore whenever he thought he had the upper hand. But as I sat down across from him, I felt something I didn't expect: clarity. For the first time, I wasn't just his daughter sitting at the table, powerless. I was a woman who had spent years building her own life, overcoming the hurdles he'd thrown in my path, and now I had the receipts. The proof that he was full of it. And I wasn't about to back down. As I stared across the room at him, I could practically hear him saying, "You wouldn't dare." But little did he know, I was about to show him something that would leave him speechless. Something he never saw coming. I won't lie, the first few minutes in the courtroom felt like I was stuck in some twisted game, and my dad was the one calling the shots. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. His lawyer, this slick, corporate type, kept shooting me these looks like I was some naive kid who had no idea what was going on. And my dad, sitting there with that smug grin plastered on his face, looked like he thought he was about to win the lottery. He probably thought I wouldn't even show up, or at least, that I wouldn't have anything that could challenge him. I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was just going to sit there and take it. His lawyer kicked things off by presenting his case, some story about how he had sacrificed everything for me, how he'd given up his own happiness to raise me, which, by the way, was laughable. He even started reading out loud some so-called proof that he'd put in the paperwork. Things like raising a child is expensive, and he used all these generic phrases that sounded like they came straight out of a parenting book. I felt my blood start to boil. Sure, raising a kid is expensive. But no one told me he'd be collecting payment for every toy he ever bought or for every meal he cooked. I mean, come on, that's what parents are supposed to do, right? It's not some investment they can cash out on when they feel like it. But this guy? He thought he was entitled to a cash reward. I kept my cool, though. I wasn't going to let him see me sweat. But the way the lawyer kept hammering home these emotional stories about how hard my dad worked for me, how he was always there, well, it was starting to get under my skin. I was getting frustrated, and I was starting to feel like the world was watching, waiting to see if I'd just fold and let him win. The lawyer wrapped up his little performance and glanced at me, like I was just supposed to roll over. I could feel my hands shaking as I pulled out my stack of receipts. I mean, I knew I had everything ready, but still, there was this weight to it. It wasn't just a bunch of receipts, it was my whole life in these little slips of paper. Every bill I paid on my own, every time I'd figured things out by myself because he was too busy to help, or worse, just too selfish to care. I was about to hand the receipts to the judge, when suddenly, my dad stood up. "Your Honor," he said, voice booming with that tone he always used when he thought he had the upper hand. "What my daughter is trying to do is disrespectful. She's just trying to avoid responsibility and shift the blame onto me. I've always been there for her. Always. I don't think she understands the burden it was to raise her. To give her everything she needed." I almost choked on my own frustration. His words were so empty, so full of himself, that it made me sick. I could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to spill over. This wasn't some dramatic movie scene where I dramatically shout, "You're a liar," and slam my fist down on the table. No, this was real life, and I had to stay calm. But it was hard, so damn hard, to sit there and hear him act like he was some hero. The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing between the two of us. I could feel the weight of his stare, like he was silently wondering who was really telling the truth. The room felt smaller, and time seemed to stretch on forever as I finally broke the silence. "Your Honor, if I may," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was racing. I knew this was the moment. I had to make it count. I've got evidence that says otherwise. I slid the receipts across the table, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on me. The judge picked them up, flipping through the pages. My dad's smug expression didn't fade, but I could see the uncertainty start to creep into his eyes. He was trying so hard to stay composed, but something was shifting. You see, I continued, taking a deep breath, I've been paying for my own stuff since I was 16. I don't think you remember that, Dad. All those sacrifices you made? They were your choices, not mine. I never asked you to give me money. You were supposed to be my parent, not my personal loan officer. I could feel the tension rise as the judge read through the evidence. Each receipt, each bill, each text message felt like a punch in the gut to my dad. It was like I was showing him all the times he claimed to help, only to prove that he hadn't actually done anything. His face changed. That cocky, self-assured grin started to fade, replaced with a scowl. He looked like he was trying to figure out how to weasel his way out of this. For a moment, I felt like I had him. I thought, this is it. I'm going to win this. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get any crazier, he did the one thing I wasn't expecting. He started to cry. I don't mean the fake tears either. No, this was the kind of sobbing I'd only seen when he was trying to manipulate someone. The kind of sobbing that made him look like the victim. Like he had been wronged. I could feel my blood pressure skyrocket. My dad had always known how to turn on the waterworks when it suited him, and this felt like one of his oldest tricks. He was playing the role of the broken father, the one who was misunderstood. And it was working. People in the room started shifting uncomfortably. The judge looked unsure. I started to panic. Was I about to lose this whole thing just because he decided to play the martyr? But then I remembered something. Something that would end it all. The judge didn't seem sure how to handle my dad's little performance. I was starting to feel the sweat prickling at the back of my neck as his sobs filled the room. Was this seriously happening? He'd pulled out the big guns, the waterworks, the pour me routine, like he was some kind of victim. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my composure. I couldn't let him manipulate me again, not this time. But the room? The room was reacting exactly how he wanted. His lawyer was nodding sympathetically, the judge was looking at him like he was some sort of tragic figure, and even the clerk at the back seemed uncomfortable. My heart was pounding. This was all going wrong. All I wanted was to prove that I wasn't just some cash cow for his ego. But here I was, sitting across from my dad, watching as he used every trick in the book to flip the script. Dad, this isn't going to work, I finally muttered, trying to find my voice, but my throat felt tight. He looked at me, eyes bloodshot from the fake tears, and there it was again, the look of triumph. He thought he was winning. Sweetheart, he said, his voice shaking with emotion, you don't understand. Everything I did for you. I gave up everything for you. I gave you a life, a future. You owe me, and you know it. Oh, here we go. The classic guilt trip. I didn't ask for your sacrifices, I shot back, the words slipping out before I could stop them. You did those things for your own damn ego. You wanted to be seen as the good father, the martyr. But you never cared about me, not really. The room fell silent. For a moment, it was just me, him, and the overwhelming weight of everything I'd ever bottled up. My hands were clammy, but my chest was starting to feel like I could breathe again. I had to remind myself that I wasn't just fighting him for the money. No, I was fighting for my freedom, for the life I'd built despite him. He couldn't take that away from me. Not now, not ever. But then he pulled out the big card. Your Honor, he said, pausing dramatically. She doesn't understand the sacrifices I made. She doesn't realize how much I've given her, how much I've given up. My dad's lawyer stood up, adjusting his suit like he was about to make a point. I believe what Mr. Matthews is trying to say is that these sacrifices are priceless, and they have come at great cost to him. Raising a child is no small feat, and certainly, those expenses should not be ignored. I could feel the tide turning again, like they were all starting to gang up on me. But I couldn't let it happen. Not now. The judge nodded, clearly considering what was being said. The air in the courtroom felt like it was thickening, suffocating me with each passing second. My mind was racing, trying to think of how to turn this back in my favor. Then, just when I thought I was about to lose everything, something clicked. It was that damn text message. I'd forgotten all about it until now, buried under a pile of receipts. But there it was, the moment he'd shown his true colors. The text where he admitted he was just using me to fund his own lifestyle. The one where he said he didn't care if I got the message as long as he got what he wanted. I shot a quick glance at my lawyer, who had been quiet up until this point. I could see the light of realization in his eyes while I slid him my phone under the table. He didn't hesitate, he jumped up, went to the judge, and handed over the phone. The room went completely still. "Your Honor," he began, "I think it's important to see the full context of this situation. My client has some very relevant evidence here." The judge accepted the phone and read the message. For what felt like an eternity, he just stared at it, and I could feel my dad's eyes burning holes in the back of my skull. He had no idea what was coming. "You don't understand, Dad," I whispered under my breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is it. This is where you lose." The judge finally looked up from the screen, his expression unreadable. My dad was still trying to hold onto that air of superiority, but I could see the cracks starting to form. He'd been caught red-handed. "Mr. Matthews," the judge said, his voice calm, but with an edge. "It seems you've made some questionable statements here." My dad's face twisted in confusion, like he was trying to process the fact that he wasn't in control anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked back at his lawyer, who, to my surprise, wasn't looking at him with the usual confidence. Instead, his brow was furrowed, and he seemed to be contemplating his next move. This wasn't going according to the script. My dad, who always thought he could manipulate any situation, was starting to realize that his usual tricks weren't going to cut it. But just when I thought I had the upper hand, my dad did something that shook me to my core. "Fine," he said, standing up, his voice now completely devoid of emotion. "I admit it. You think you've won, don't you?" I froze. What was he saying? "I've always been the bad guy in your story. You've always had your little receipts, your little evidence," he spat, his voice rising now. "But here's the truth, I didn't do this for you. I did it for me. I wanted to feel like I was important for once." The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't the victory I'd been expecting. The silence in the courtroom felt like a thunderstorm that was just waiting to explode. My dad had confessed, admitted that everything he'd done, all those years of so-called sacrifices, were just about him, his need to feel important, to feel like he mattered. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I had spent so much of my life believing his manipulative lies, thinking I was the problem, that maybe I wasn't grateful enough, or I owed him something. But hearing him say it? That was different. That was real. My dad stood there, his eyes wild, his fists clenched. He wasn't the same man I had known growing up. This wasn't the father I'd always looked up to, the one I'd tried so hard to win over, to please. This was a man who was unraveling, and honestly, it felt a little satisfying. But also terrifying. Because, suddenly, I realized just how far he would go to maintain control. Even if it meant destroying the truth. He glared at me, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. "You think this is over? You think I'm just going to let you walk away, and pretend none of this ever happened? You're wrong. I've made you who you are. Without me, you wouldn't even have the life you have now." His words were so familiar, so predictable. But this time, they didn't sting. This time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the child who owed him anything. I was done being manipulated. I took a deep breath, locking eyes with him. The truth was out there now, raw and exposed. And no matter how much he screamed, how much he tried to twist the narrative, it wasn't going to change what had happened. "You're right," I said, my voice finally steady, louder than it had ever been before. "You didn't make me. You weren't some kind of savior. You were just a man who couldn't handle his own responsibilities and tried to use me as a way to fix his own life. But guess what, Dad? I don't need you anymore." The words came out of me like a weight being lifted off my chest. Every ounce of pain, frustration, and anger that had built up over the years poured out in that one sentence. I wasn't some little girl anymore. I was an adult, a woman who had made it through the fire, who had fought for everything I had. And I wasn't about to let this man drag me down again. The judge's gavel slammed down, and I could hear the echo in the silence that followed. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Matthews, your attempt to manipulate the court is not only unacceptable, but it is also transparent. Your behavior is not lost on me." My dad's face twisted. He didn't even know how to respond. The game he thought he'd been playing was over. And I was the one holding the winning hand. Then, the judge turned his gaze to me. "Ms. Matthews, I've reviewed the evidence presented, and I must say, it paints a very different picture than the one Mr. Matthews has attempted to portray. Your receipts, your documents, they don't lie. You've been independent, self-sufficient, and responsible. And I find no reason to rule in Mr. Matthews' favor." I felt like I'd just been given a second wind, a burst of energy that I didn't even know I had. The tension in my shoulders eased, my breath coming easier, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to exhale. My dad's head dropped, his shoulders slumping like he had just been knocked down a few pegs, which, I guess he had. But he wasn't done. No. He wasn't going to let this go that easily. "You're making a huge mistake," he spat at the judge. "She's lying. All of this is fake. She's just trying to ruin me." Before he could go off on another tirade, I stood up. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, the energy in the room shifting as I locked my gaze on my dad, who was now trying to regain his composure. "I'm done listening to your lies," I said, my voice clear, strong. "I'm done letting you control the narrative. For once, I'm taking back my life. I don't need you, and I sure as hell don't need your money. You can't buy my silence anymore." His face flushed crimson, like he couldn't believe what was happening. He was so used to getting what he wanted, to twisting the situation in his favor, that I think he was genuinely stunned to see that it wasn't working anymore. I glanced at the judge, who seemed just as done with the drama. "Your Honor," I said, turning to him, "I've had enough of the manipulation. I'm asking that you dismiss this case entirely. There's no merit to it, and frankly, I've had enough of him trying to control my life." The judge gave a sharp nod. "I agree. The case is dismissed. Mr. Matthews, you may leave." I didn't hear anything else after that. My heart was pounding in my chest, but it wasn't from fear or anger anymore. It was from relief, from the overwhelming sense that I had finally taken control, that I had finally stood up to him in a way that no one ever thought I could. My dad stood there for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to come up with something to say. But nothing came out. The judge had made his decision, and it was over. No amount of bluster, no amount of emotional manipulation, could change that. He stormed out of the room, but I didn't care. I didn't even watch him go. I turned to my lawyer, who gave me a reassuring smile, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile back. It wasn't a victory I had planned for. It wasn't some Hollywood ending where I dramatically take down my villain of a father. But it was real. It was mine. and I was free. It's funny how a moment of clarity can change everything. A few weeks ago, I would have never imagined I'd be here, sitting in my apartment, still reeling from what happened in that courtroom, but also feeling this strange sense of freedom. My dad had always been a looming presence in my life, casting a shadow over my every move. He was the kind of person who made you feel small, like you were always in debt to him, even when you didn't owe him a thing. But walking out of that courtroom, knowing I had stood up to him and taken control for the first time, felt incredible. I won't lie, the aftermath wasn't all roses and sunshine. My dad didn't just take the loss quietly. Of course, he tried calling, texting, even emailing, trying to get me to talk to him, to clear the air. But I wasn't having it. I wasn't going to let him back in so easily, not after everything he'd done. I'd spent my whole life trying to get his approval, trying to prove myself to him, but that day? That was the day I stopped chasing it. The messages started coming in, first polite, then increasingly desperate. "You don't understand," he'd say. "You're my daughter, I did everything for you. Don't you want to make this right?" And every time, I just hit delete. The first few times, it felt strange, like I was betraying some part of myself. But as the weeks went by, it started feeling more like a weight was lifting off me. His words no longer had the power to hurt. They were just noise. Empty noise. In a weird way, that whole experience gave me a new perspective on my life, on myself. For years, I had defined myself by what he thought of me, by what he expected me to be. His approval was a currency I traded in, hoping one day I'd be good enough. But what happened in that courtroom? It shattered that illusion. It was like I'd finally looked in the mirror and saw myself for the first time, not through his lens, but through my own. And what I saw wasn't some failure or some disappointed daughter. I saw a woman who had built her own life, made her own decisions, and fought like hell to get where she was. I guess that's the part no one ever tells you about breaking free from someone like that. It's not just about cutting them off, it's about rediscovering who you are when you stop measuring yourself by their standards. The relief wasn't just in the win, it was in the realization that I didn't need him anymore. And, if I'm being honest, there were moments when I started to feel bad about how things ended up. There were times I wondered if maybe I should have tried harder to keep the peace, to not let things spiral so far out of control. But then I remembered all the years of manipulation, the guilt trips, the emotional blackmail. I remembered all the times I'd given more than I could afford, just hoping to get a little bit of love in return, and how he always took and took without giving back. That's not family. That's not love. It's control. And when I finally stopped letting him control me, that's when I felt like I could breathe. In the weeks that followed, I started focusing on myself again. I'd been so consumed with the chaos of the lawsuit that I had forgotten what it was like to just live. I started working out again, getting back to the things I loved, writing, reading, spending time with friends who actually cared about me. I even started seeing a therapist, just to talk through everything and make sure I was really processing what had happened. It wasn't about fixing myself, it was about reclaiming the parts of me that had been buried under years of self-doubt and manipulation. But the thing that really stuck with me was how much stronger I felt. It wasn't just the win in court, it was the realization that I didn't have to keep fighting for someone else's approval. I didn't need to be the person my dad wanted me to be. I could just be me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Of course, things weren't perfect. My dad didn't disappear from my life entirely, even if I wanted him to. He'd still send the occasional "I miss you" text, or show up at family gatherings with that same old "woe is me" act. But now, I knew how to deal with it. I didn't let him drag me back into his world of guilt and manipulation. When he showed up, I kept my distance. When he tried to play the victim, I reminded myself that I was no longer his puppet. And as for the money? Well, that was just the icing on the cake. In the end, he didn't get a cent. The court ruled in my favor, and I walked out of that place knowing I hadn't just won a legal battle, I'd won my freedom. And that was worth far more than any amount of money he could ever try to extort from me. So, where does that leave me now? It leaves me in control. For the first time, I'm the one calling the shots in my life. I'm the one deciding who gets access to me and who doesn't. And the most important lesson I learned through it all? That I am enough, just as I am. I don't need anyone's validation, especially not from someone who never had my best interests at heart. I've got me, and that's all I need.